For the third part of this lecture series, we'll talk about causal attributions. If you'll remember for when we talked about correlations in research methods and about what a causal attribution is, this is ultimately explaining why something happened, or causally linking, thus saying one thing causes another, two different items, or it could be more. But this will be specific about people and has got to be one of my favorite topics in social psychology apart from my actual domains of research. Now, why? Right? That's the question. Simply put, this question can terrorize parents when children want to know something and then get stuck in a loop. We have all seen a child go, but why, but why, but why, but why, over and over, or we've done it to other people just to mess with them. Now, it isn't just kids though, so next time you see it happening, don't just think the kid is evil. But all of us struggle with the same question. We're endlessly fascinated by why people do the things that they do. This is why a lot of television shows get as popular as they are, because a lot of them are just about people doing random stuff and then trying to understand why the heck they do the strange things that they do. While this is true for the world at large, and us trying to explain why certain things happen in the world, it is especially the case when it comes to other human beings. At the end of the day, we are just endlessly fascinated and obsessed with, well, ourselves and other people. Attribution theory is what focuses on exactly this question, and it is a description of the way in which people explain the causes of their own and other people's behavior. These attributions, or at least under attribution theory, attributions in general can be classed into two different categories. Internal or dispositional attributions, which are inferences that a person is behaving a certain way because of something about the person themselves, such as an attitude that they have, something about their character or their personality. This is contrasted with external or situational attributions, and these are inferences that a person is behaving in a certain way because of something about the situation they are in. And here the assumption is that most people would respond in the same way in that situation. That is just basically to say that regardless of what your personality happens to be, it is the situation driving this actual behavior, and therefore whoever you put into that situation will act in a similar way. One theory that's been put forward to explain how we either come up with internal or external attributions when judging someone else is the covariation model. And this is a theory that states that to form an attribution about what caused a person's behavior, we systematically note the patterns between the presence or absence of possible causal factors and whether the behavior occurs or not. Now, there are three main types of information that we are supposedly paying attention to, and this is consensus information. How do others behave in this similar circumstance, right? Do other people behave in that same way? Distinctiveness information, how unique is that event, or does it happen all the time? And then consistency information is, does the same thing always happen given a specific situation or context, or was this a one-off or a rare event? Now, let's look at how these play out. You can find this in a table in your book if you'd like to look at it some more. So if consensus and distinctiveness information is low and consistency information is high, then we're likely to make an internal attribution about the actor, or the one who's generating the behavior. So in this case, for example, the boss is the only person who yells at Hannah. This is low consensus, because not everybody else yells at Hannah. The boss yells at everyone. This is low in distinctiveness, because the boss yells at everyone. And it is high in consistency because the boss yells at Hannah whenever the boss sees Hannah. In this case, we're likely to make an internal or dispositional attribution about the boss, who is the actor, right? The boss is a tool, or some other choice word that you'd like to use. For a different example, if consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency are all high, we're likely to make an external attribution about the actor, or the one who's generating the behavior. So if everyone yells at Hannah, this is high consensus because everyone is doing it. If the boss doesn't yell at anyone else, this is high in distinctiveness. Right? It only happens when Hannah is present. And it's also high in consistency in this case because the boss yells at Hannah whenever the boss sees Hannah. Here we're likely to say that poor boss, Hannah is always driving them nuts, because it's something that Hannah is now doing. It's no longer the boss at fault, even though I would recommend never yelling at people in the workplace. In situations where all three are low, we tend to think of the situation itself as a little bit strange, and it is less clear-cut how we will form our attribution. Now, there are a few drawbacks to this model. The first, and probably most fundamental, is that it assumes that people make these types of attributions in a rational and logical way, which, while human beings are capable of being rational and logical, it is not necessarily the most common way in which we interact and form our impressions. This is also the reason why oftentimes economics and models that come from that field can oftentimes be so erroneously or just so grievously wrong, let's say. It's not because economists aren't smart, and it's not because economists don't make some incredibly cool models, and it's not because economists don't use statistics. They do. They use some of the most advanced statistics in the world. But one of the fundamental underlying assumptions in most economics models is that the human being is a rational creature who is making cost-benefit analysis all the time and thus choosing what to buy or do, which is just not the case in how we operate. So this is one of the drawbacks of this model, where we're not always just sitting there and being like, okay, well, how often did this happen? Okay, it happened this many times, but there were these many situations in which it didn't happen also, and then some other people also engaged in this behavior, but not everybody. Does that make it most people? And well, how often did it happen? Well, it happened sometimes I was there, but what about all the times I wasn't there? We oftentimes don't go through such a drawn-out process. We just make quick decisions about people. So this is one of the drawbacks of this model. Further, it turns out that people use consensus information far less than was originally assumed. They're not ignorant of it, or oblivious for that matter, but they just don't pay that much attention to consensus information about everybody else and what they do in the moment when a specific person is operating in a certain way. Third, people don't always have access to all those pieces of information. Right? If you are asking someone something for the first time and then you judge them based on their response, you don't have any information by which to say if that is a consistent behavior or not. Moving on to one of the core tenets, I guess, of attribution theory is the fundamental attribution error. And this is the tendency to overestimate the extent to which people's behavior is due to internal or dispositional factors and to underestimate the role that situational or contextual factors play in their behavior. This is thought to arise because of the schema that many people hold. And that schema is, people do what they do because of the type of people they are, and not so much because of the situation that they're in. And the vast majority of us have this schema, and you could say that a lot of it stems from the ideas of free will, that I am a free will agent, and therefore I am able to choose what I want to do, and what I prefer to do is based on who I am. It is easier to disregard situational factors in this, because oftentimes when we think about the situation influencing us, we have to consider the fact that we might not be as free and autonomous as we are, which goes against our grain and much of our philosophical teachings, or religious ones for that matter. Not going to get into that too much. Okay, so just an example, a quick one, then I'll talk about some empirical demonstrations on the next paper. But so when or after Rosa Parks passed away, they implemented on many of the metropolitan bus systems a tribute to Rosa Parks Day. And what they had people do in this case is they left one seat directly behind the driver free for that whole day. And no one was meant to sit there because it was a tribute to Rosa Parks. And this specific example comes from New York City, and a journalist decided to see if that was actually something that would happen. Now, New York is another place that's immensely crowded. You, at least those of you who have lived in San Francisco now for a while and have taken the bus anywhere, know that it's immensely crowded even in regular hours. And in rush hour times, it is almost ridiculous because people are often packed like sardines. So this is the case in New York as well. They do have their metro system, but the buses get used too. So what the journalist found is that the majority of people respected this. They actually did not sit in that seat for most of the day. And that's not as exciting because, we would classify them, quote unquote, as good people. But be careful for that attribution error. They were, however, people who sat in that seat. And just imagine for yourself, you're sitting there, you know that that seat is meant to be left open, and you see someone sit down. What's the first thought you're going to have? Now, the journalist, being a good journalist, didn't just assume. The journalist actually asked the people why they were sitting there. Don't they care? And it turned out that most of these people, as soon as they found out what that seat was meant to be for, immediately got up. They felt very embarrassed, and a lot of them never saw any of the signs that said, aha, this is a seat being left open because of this tribute. Now, if it had just been left there, it would be so easy to think of them as horrible, racist people, but a little bit more examination showed that it actually had nothing to do with who they were as people, and just a matter of them not actually seeing a sign posted on the window. In fact, part of the story in your textbook goes that someone sat down, became aware of this, and then moved the sign so it was on the seat itself so it would be more obvious. Now, just think about your own lives. How often it is easy to be lost in music or a cell phone screen, and on top of that, there is a strong tradition here of not talking to anybody else on public transit because, well, honestly, I'm not sure why that's a thing, because it's weird not to talk to people who are around you. Again, that's just me, so you don't have to believe that. How would you have found out? How would you have known? If you hadn't looked up from your cell phone in the 10 minutes you were on the bus, how would you know that there was a sign? And do you read all the signs in public transit? And if you don't, how would you have known? And would it have been fair if somebody else judged you as being a racist for something you never saw? Unfortunately, this attribution error happens a lot. This is why it's called the fundamental attribution error. And we almost overwhelmingly will think that whatever people do, it's because of who they are, not the situation they're in. Here's a stark empirical demonstration to show exactly the same phenomenon. So Jones and Harris in 1967 wrote a paper called The Attribution of Attitudes, and this refers specifically to the first study. So here what they had is two different essays. They had one essay that was a pro-Castro essay, and they had another essay that was an anti-Castro essay. And these were adjusted to be of equal writing style and presentations, and they basically were set to look like a college student's paper that would receive about a C. So not too fancy, not too bad, just average. Now, participants were told that this essay was either written freely, meaning they could choose whether they wanted to write a pro-Castro or an anti-Castro essay, or they were told that this essay was written under the direction of a professor. The professor dictated whether a person could write for Castro or against Castro. After this, participants read these essays, and then they were instructed to judge the true feelings of the person who wrote that essay. And the scores ranged from 10 to extremely against Castro, the essayist person, or all the way up to 70, which was extremely for Castro. Now, when the essay was supposedly freely written, the results matched what you would expect. When the pro-essay was judged, people rated the actual writer, hypothetically, as being quite pro-Castro, a score of 59.62 on average, which is very close to the top end of 70. When they judged the person's attitudes when they read the anti-Castro essay, they found ratings on average of about 17.38, which is much closer to the extreme anti scale of this rating. Now, that in itself is not that surprising. Where it gets pretty wild is how they judged the attitudes of the people when they were told that those essays were dictated by the professor, and at no point did the students choose which side they were going to write for. And here, for the anti-essay, you again see a very negative outlook, or the assumption that the person who wrote the essay is biased against Castro. And for the pro-essay, you actually see positive ratings. Thankfully, they're not as positive as the other, because then that would mean we don't pay attention to their environment at all. But here, again, it was assumed that the person who wrote the pro essay actually felt pro-Castro. Now, if you think about this for a second, there is no information in the no choice condition to judge this. There is no way to know what that person feels like because you were told, right, are cupcakes good or are cupcakes bad? You don't have any choice in whether you feel about cupcakes and how they're good or bad. The same with Castro or with anything else. Yet we still assumed that these papers reflected some internal disposition, their own personal feelings of the essayist about how they felt, even though we're told that the environment did not allow for that. The environment did not allow them to express their own opinions. This just goes to show you how powerful this attributional bias is. Another factor that influences our attributional bias in this way is something called perceptual salience. And perceptual salience refers to the seeming importance of information that is the focus of people's attention. This just means that things we're focused on will seem much more important to us than things we're not focused on, which makes sense. When we're relating this to the fundamental attribution error, since people are pretty much almost always the most salient things in our immediate environments, save maybe our telephones, we tend to focus on them more than almost everything else. And you could say to yourself also that even when we are staring at our phones, other than addicting games, we look at photos of people or videos of people. We're just obsessed with people. It's what we focus on pretty much the most. And if that's what we're focusing all the time, we will tend not to notice other things going on around us, like context. To show the dramatic impacts of this, Taylor and Fisk in 1975 wrote a paper called Point of View and Perceptions of Causality, and here's an image to show what the people were organized as. So each session consisted of 6 participants, and they were viewing a conversation between 2 accomplices. Just a moment. All right. So these 2 are the accomplices sitting here in the middle. They're 2 actors, and they always gave exactly the same conversation. It was scripted. Now, of the 6 participants, 2 of them were placed on either side of the actors and had equal view of both faces, as you can see with these arrows. 2 were placed behind actor A, and they had a direct view of the face of actor B, but they could not see the face of actor A. And the converse is true for these 2. They could see the face of the actor A, but not the face of actor B. And so they put them all to sit down, and then they had the actors or the accomplices have their conversation. And what happened is, at the end of this conversation, they had people rate what they thought of that conversation and which of the 2 was leading the conversation, which was more dominant, which contributed more, so on and so forth. And the results found some interesting things. So the observers who looked at both faces, observers in this case A plus B and A plus B on both sides, they rated the conversation as being roughly equally carried by both accomplices. What's pretty strange though is the observers who were placed behind one or the other of the accomplices, they did kind of, I guess. They rated the conversation as being carried by the one whose face they could see, and they judged the person whose face they could not see as having contributed less. And this just showed that what we're paying attention to will change how we form our attributions. Now, this might seem like a silly little example in a psychology experiment, but it has some pretty dramatic real-world implications. It has been shown that when we are seeing a recording of a suspect giving a confession and the video is taped looking directly at the suspect, we will judge them as being far more guilty than if the video recording of the interview shows both the suspect and the officer from a more equal perspective. It is actually pretty stark. To this day, as far as I know, and I tried to look into it to see if it's changed every time I give this lecture, but New Zealand is the only country in the world that has mandated equal focus interviews, such that whenever a police officer of some kind or law officer interviews some kind of suspect, they are mandated by law to record the interview and record the interview in such a way that both the officer and the suspect's faces are given equal focus. Because ultimately, you make more accurate judgments in this way, or we're less biased. Now, almost no other country has this. Well, as far as I know, no other country has this, which is unfortunately pretty sad, because many papers have come out to show that even in real-world recordings of police suspects and interviews in this country, in the United States, in Australia, it causes significant bias and changes how we interpret guilt and innocence just by the perspective in which those video recordings are taken. Just something to consider. Looking at how to get a little bit out of this fundamental attribution error, we have something called the two-step attribution process. And this refers to the idea that our final attributions are ultimately the result of two-step processes. And the idea here is that the first attribution that we make is almost always going to be a dispositional or internal attribution about that other person, something about them, their personality or character. And then if, and only if, and that's really important, only if the person making the attribution has time, energy, focus, and intention to just spend some extra time thinking about that person they just made an attribution about, only if that's the case, they can begin to examine the context and use it to adjust their existing attribution. If they're distracted, if they're exhausted, if their attention is somewhere else, they're unlikely to make this second step and will just stay at that original dispositional attribution without updating it whatsoever. And we have seen how those can last and persevere for an extended period of time. Next, let's talk about self-serving attributions. And these are attributions we make about ourselves, and they're self-serving because oftentimes they're used to protect our self-esteem. In Western cultures, one tends to make internal attributions for one's successes. I did it, or I won because of something about me, and one tends to make external attributions for failures. I flunked on that exam because the exam was too hard, or the trains outside kept me awake all night and I couldn't sleep. This does vary by culture, which we will talk about in the next section. Another reason this pattern emerges has to do with the information that's available to any single person. So a way to think about that would be, it's easy if one fails an exam to think that the exam was too hard because you only have your own exam to see. Whereas the professor might see all of the set of exams, and while you might be someone who flunked the exam, there may also be a large group of people who did really well on the exam. And for them, it might not be then the assumption of the exam, but rather the specific students who did not do well. This is not to say that there couldn't be contextual factors surrounding the student's failure, but oftentimes this discrepancy in what information is available will change the types of attributions we make. Another significant attributional bias that happens is oftentimes termed belief in a just world. And this starts with another schema that many people possess. That schema is that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Now, I don't mean to attack any of your beliefs, just be aware that this is a recorded and well-documented phenomenon. Now, in reality, while good things do happen, there are also a lot of tragic and horrible things that happen as well, and for many of us, when those tragic and horrible events happen, we have a very difficult time understanding why they happened. For example, how could someone have gotten cancer, right? It just doesn't make any sense, especially if we're thinking to ourselves, they were so careful and they never smoked, or something to that effect. It becomes really hard for us to understand why, and as you've seen throughout this lecture, we're pretty obsessed with coming up with explanations of why. And it is very hard for our minds to grapple with the idea that random things happen. We don't like that feeling, because at the end of the day, it makes us confront the fact that those bad things could happen to us as well, because there is no real rhyme or reason for how they happen. So in order to protect ourselves from that negative emotionality and fear that comes up when those situations arise, we ultimately default to that aforementioned schema and come up with a reason why those people deserved it. something about them that is different than me is why they are suffering now. This is ultimately the root of victim blaming. One of the most stark places this is seen is in rape cases, and one has sadly too many times heard that, oh, they were raped or assaulted because they were wearing revealing clothes. I don't know how else to put this, but that is bullshit. No one deserves that happening to them. Ever. At all. No. That is inexcusable. Further, it shows ignorance about the actual phenomena. Most people who are survivors of rape or sexual assault are not assaulted by some random stranger after they've left a club. No, they're assaulted by people they know. A huge amount of sexual assault happens in relationships, which, while you might be thinking, that doesn't make sense to me, no, consent is forever. Just because you get married to somebody doesn't mean you have consent all the time. You have to continually get consent. That's how it works, right? You don't just say, I'm in the mood for Italian food, and then someone takes you to Italian food all the time. Just because you said you were in the mood one time doesn't mean you're in the mood forever. Something to be careful of. Also, pretty much no one deserves horrible things happening to them. In my opinion, no one deserves horrible things happening to them. As hard as that is for people to understand, it is not about deserving. You might seek retribution on someone because of perceived wrongs that you're feeling or somebody else around you, but that is different than someone cosmically deserving something bad happening to them. Be aware of this. A lot of times this happens, it sneaks up in insidious ways, and it is something to be careful of. As I was talking about rape survivors, one of the places it was actually most widely studied, and they came to these conclusions, were the questions paramedics would ask survivors. Oftentimes the questions centered around something that they had done or what was their behavior around it, instead of actually just caring for the survivor. Now, those people, the paramedics, weren't doing it on purpose. They weren't actually trying to make them feel worse, right? If anything, paramedics are some of the unsung heroes of the world who are always showing up everywhere first without any kind of armament or anything. It is ultimately a bias that all human beings seem to have, to varying degrees. Be aware. On that note, there is also the bias blind spot, and this refers to the idea that we're all pretty much biased about our own bias. And specifically, most of us tend to believe that we're less biased than the average person, and this applies in many, many domains. You see this in things like intelligence, where if you ask people to say, do you think you're in the top half of intelligent people or the bottom half of intelligent people, way more than half of the people will think that they're in the top half of the intelligent category. Same thing with driving, right? There's this common joke of most of us think that we're above average drivers. It's just not something that happens because it doesn't fit with the way averages work. So again, just be aware. Almost all of us tend to think that we're less biased than other people. Please remember that there are many domains in which bias can exist, and while we might never know how we compare to other people in terms of our bias, it is a safe bet to assume that most of us are more biased than we believe ourselves to be.